The first time I realized things had changed. It was in my own kitchen. The room I had built with my husband. Brick by brick. Nail by nail. Sweat on our brows. Hands raw and aching. I still remembered the smell of sawdust and cedar the day we finished the counters. That smell had lingered through every Thanksgiving. Every birthday. Every quiet Sunday morning sipping coffee before the world woke. And now, the smell of betrayal hung heavier than any winter cold. "Mom," my son said, his voice too casual, almost rehearsed. "You're lucky we're only asking $600 a month." He slid a stack of papers across the kitchen counter as if it were a dinner menu. Not a document evicting me from the life I built. His wife, my daughter-in-law, perched in the living room with that soft, honeyed smile that hid teeth sharpened in calculation, chimed in. "We figured this was the fairest way. You know, just to make sure everyone's contributing." I looked down at the papers, hands trembling not from age but from disbelief. My name was barely dry on the lease line before my mind started flashing back 40 years. 40 years of labor. Of dreams hammered into walls. Of fence posts dug by hand. Of the first rose bush planted with my husband in the small patch of sunlight outside the kitchen window. I remembered the nights I stayed awake listening to him snore. The first Christmas tree we decorated. The way the morning sun would hit the hardwood floors and make them shine like gold. And now I was being asked to pay to live here. I didn't speak. I simply stared at the chipped tile on the wall, the tile I had laid myself when my hands were steady and my knees unbroken. The house had been my world, and suddenly it had become foreign. I thought of the times I moved in with my son and his wife after my husband passed, believing that family meant closeness. Shared meals, laughter echoing through the hallways. I had cooked for them, cleaned for them, even babysat their children without complaint, offering every ounce of energy and love I had left. And this was how they repaid me. With contracts and lines of paper that reduced me to a tenant. A monthly bill. A liability. "Is this your idea?" I asked finally, my voice quiet, a thin thread cutting through the tension. He hesitated, shifting uneasily. "It's something we talked about," he muttered. I nodded slowly and walked away to my room that night, staring at the ceiling in the dim light, the air cold against my aching bones. I traced the outlines of the photo frames on the wall. The wedding picture, family vacations, birthday parties, all of it suddenly felt borrowed, like someone had rewritten my history without asking. The next morning, I signed the papers, not because I agreed, not because I was weak. I signed because I needed time to breathe. Time to see if the boy I raised still lived somewhere inside the man who had handed me a lease to my own home. Time to plan. And in that silence, something shifted. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was a quiet, heavy realization. They didn't see me anymore. Not as a mother. Not as a builder. Not even as a human being. They saw me as a bill. Days passed. The house grew colder than usual. Michigan cold that settled in your bones. I turned the thermostat up slightly, not extravagantly. Just enough to keep the frost from creeping under the door and biting my knees. The next morning, a note appeared on the fridge. "Please don't adjust the thermostat without asking. Electricity isn't free." The handwriting was tight, slanted, mechanical, unmistakably hers. My daughter-in-law had a way of making authority feel like sweetness. But I recognized it for what it was. Control. That evening, I asked my son gently, quietly, why I needed permission to heat the house I had built. Before he could answer, she interrupted. "Just because she gave birth to you doesn't mean she gets a free pass for life." Her words hit like a slap. I turned, expecting regret, a flicker of conscience. But there was none. Only calculation. They moved me into the smallest bedroom in the house shortly after. The room was once a storage closet, windowless and tight. Barely enough space for a single bed. They called it cozier. A curtain replaced the door. My dresser was left in the hallway. That first night, curled under a thin blanket against the draft, I realized something terrifying. They were erasing me. Not loudly, not with confrontation, but quietly, systematically, like a tide slowly pulling a body out to sea. I wasn't allowed to cook anymore. "We're doing meal prep now." The washer could only be used at night. I had to ask before inviting a friend over. Every request polite, but each chipped away at my existence. They weren't just removing Methy, were attempting to replace me. Erase the years of love, sacrifice, and life etched into these walls. Then came the comment I overheard. One I was never meant to hear. She should have thought twice before giving us the house and expecting a free ride. My daughter-in-law said to a neighbor. Those words stopped me cold. Giving them the house. I had never given them anything but trust. I remembered the document I had signed 2 years ago while hospitalized. Trusting my son to manage the mortgage and property while I recovered. I had signed it without reading carefully. Thinking it was temporary. Thinking it was normal. And they had exploited that moment, turning it into a permanent control over my life. But I was not defenseless. Before I was a mother, a wife, I had been a clerk in a family law office. I understood paper, process, and precedent. I knew if my name had ever been on that deed, a trail remained. So I began looking. Not in the house, they had cleared that out. I went to the courthouse in town, a building of faded flags and quiet dignity, where clerks still remembered how to treat old ladies with respect. I requested the property file. The clerk, a kind-eyed woman, pulled the records, and there it was, the deed from 1984, signed by me and my husband, declaring joint ownership. Later documents had transferred temporary custody due to illness, but my name had never been removed. I still owned 51%. I took a deep breath, holding the certified copies in my hands, feeling the weight of every insult, every silent humiliation. For the first time in 2 years, my spine straightened. They thought they could reduce me to nothing, but the truth was on paper. I returned home quietly. No speeches, no threats. I began packing only the essentials. My old jewelry box, the wedding photo, the Bible, a few clothes, furniture, couches, beds. They could keep them. Memories were mine, not theirs. When my daughter-in-law saw me with suitcases, she smirked. My son did not move to stop me. And then, quietly, I realized they had underestimated me. They had tried to erase me, but they couldn't. I had been written into every corner of this house, into its walls, its floors, its garden, and soon, they would remember, because I was not leaving. Not really. The morning after I packed my essentials, I woke early, before the sun had broken the horizon. The house was silent, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I made tea, the kettle whistling in the quiet. A sound that felt like my heartbeat steady, resolute. I poured the steaming liquid into my favorite chipped mug, the one my husband had given me on our 10th anniversary, and sipped it slowly. The warmth spread through my chest, and with it came a clarity I had not felt in years. I had been diminished by their actions, reduced to numbers on a page, a tenant in a home I built. But that would end, quietly, without dramatics. I resolved to reclaim what was mine, not with anger, but with precision. The first step was the courthouse. I dressed carefully, choosing my husband's dark wool coat. It still smelled faintly of cedar, and wearing it made me feel as though a part of him walked beside me. The courthouse was a short drive away, nestled in the heart of the town, its brick walls weathered but dignified. I walked in, past the heavy wooden doors, past the marble floors worn by decades of footsteps. The clerk at the front desk glanced up, then smiled politely when she recognized me. Ruth Gardner. Right. You're here for the property file. Yes, I said, my voice steady. I need the complete records for the property on Maple Street. She nodded, pulling a stack of folders from the filing cabinets. This will take a few minutes. Do you want a seat? I nodded, settling onto the hard wooden chair. My hands were calm, my mind clear. I went over every memory of that house, every wall we painted, every nail we hammered, every meal we shared as a family. Each memory was a reminder of why I could not, would not, be erased. When she returned, I went through the records meticulously. There it was, deed from 1984, signed by me and my husband, declaring joint ownership. Other documents showed temporary transfers, but my name had never been removed. I still held 51% ownership. My heart lifted not in triumph, but in quiet validation. The house, my labor, my history, was still mine. The next step was legal counsel. I needed someone who could navigate the system without alerting them to my actions. Hannah Given, a local attorney, came highly recommended, a woman known for precision, for ruthlessness on paper, for calm in court. I visited her office, a modest brick building with large windows letting in soft morning light. Her handshake was firm, her eyes unflinching. "I've reviewed the documents," she said after I laid them on her desk. "You have every right to pursue full control of the property. The current occupants are legally vulnerable. We can file a petition for reinstatement of property rights discreetly. No court appearances unless they contest it." "Good," I said. "I want them to handle this through the trust my husband and I set up years ago. The name is neutral. They won't recognize it." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "Impressed. Smart. We can proceed without them knowing it's you." That afternoon, I signed the necessary affidavits and petitions. The paperwork felt heavy in my hands, yet it was liberating. Each signature was a reclaiming, each line a reaffirmation of my place in the life I had built. By evening, the petitions were filed, and the wheels of justice had quietly begun to turn. In the days that followed, I watched them carefully from a distance, gathering small pieces of information, noting habits, routines, and interactions. They still acted as if the house was theirs, slowing, hosting, arranging furniture, but each moment was a reminder that they had overstepped. I felt no anger, only a steady focus. This was not about revenge. It was about restoration. Then came the notice. The district court approved the initial petition, issuing a formal notice of disputed ownership to my son and daughter-in-law. The document was clear. Unless they could provide evidence disproving my retained interest, they were required to vacate or face formal eviction proceedings. They had no idea who had filed it. To them, it must have looked like a clerical error or some unexplained legal technicality. I kept my presence quiet. I did not announce anything. I continued my days as usual, tending the garden in the early morning, arranging fresh flowers on the porch, maintaining the routines that had once been mine. Every brick, every floorboard, every corner of the house remembered me. I did not need them to know. I only needed the law on my side, the right documents, and my patience. When the enforcement day arrived, I watched from across the street. The sheriff's cruiser pulled up, followed by Hannah's car. The engine barely shut off before officers approached the front door with official documents in hand. My son answered, confusion etched across his face. "What's this about?" he asked, blinking at the morning sun. "This is a legal notice of property repossession," the sheriff said calmly. "You and your wife are being asked to vacate within 48 hours due to unresolved ownership claims." My daughter-in-law appeared behind him, her voice sharp and incredulous. "Excuse me. What the hell is this? This has to be a mistake." "It's no mistake," the sheriff replied, firm but measured. "You were notified. This is the enforcement phase." I stepped onto the curb. The sound of my heels clicking against the pavement was deliberate, a metronome marking the return of truth. My hands were steady, my breath even. I reached into my purse and pulled out the original deed, holding it aloft without hesitation. 51% ownership. My name clearly marked alongside my husband's. For the first time in months, I looked directly at them. "The woman you charged rent," I said softly, "is the legal majority owner of this land." They froze. My son's voice cracked. "You can't do this." "I already did," I replied. No shouting, no anger, just quiet, unyielding truth. The sheriff nodded, handing them the final order. 48 hours to vacate. I walked back across the street without looking. The early spring wind pushed against my coat, carrying faint hints of lilac and cedar. Memories of a life built with love and effort. Behind me, the weight of years of humiliation and control evaporated. They had laughed as I packed, but they cried when they saw the deed. The house was mine, Aggie, not through rage, but through patience, diligence, and quiet courage. I did not need confrontation. I needed justice. And the law, coupled with my persistence, had provided it. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, gentle shadows across the yard. For the first time in years, the house felt alive, not just a structure of wood and nails, but a home filled with memory, love, and reclaimed dignity. And in that quiet moment, I realized something else. Life would continue. I had reclaimed my space. Yes, but I had also reclaimed my spirit. The chapters ahead would be mine to write. The first morning after the legal notice had been delivered, the house was eerily quiet. For the first time in years, I could move freely without watching over my shoulder, without feeling the weight of scrutiny or judgment pressing down from the walls themselves. I wandered from room to room, running my hands along the surfaces, remembering every detailed burn mark on the kitchen counter from the Thanksgiving gravy pot, the faded patch on the living room rug where my husband had once wrestled our son into fits of laughter, the small chip in the windowsill where he had rested his elbow while measuring for the garden fence. Every imperfection, every mark, was a memory. I decided to make the day productive. The first task was the garden. My husband had loved the garden. He had insisted on marigolds and roses, had argued with me over spacing and sunlight, had laughed at my inability to measure properly. I pulled on old gloves, dusted off the worn watering can, and began tending the beds. The soil was cold under my fingers, but it was alive, full of potential. As I dug, I remembered lessons from decades ago. Patience, persistence, care. These were not just for plants, they were for life. The hours passed quietly. I cleared dead leaves, pruned overgrown branches, and planted early blooms. Each movement was deliberate, meditative. I was reclaiming not just the house, but the life that had been paused by betrayal and grief. For the first time in years, I felt a lightness in my chest, a sense that something sacred had been returned. Later that afternoon, I ventured into town. I had not needed to leave for months. Everything essential had been nearby, and the weight of my presence-ere absence had kept me tethered at home. But now, I walked the familiar streets with a different perspective. People I had once known waved, nodded, smiled. Some recognized the change in me immediately. Others must have sensed it without knowing why. I passed the local diner, the hardware store, the small post office, and felt a connection to the rhythm of life continuing beyond the walls of my home. That evening, I returned home and sat on the porch, wrapping my hands around a steaming cup of tea. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, the breeze carrying the faint smell of lilacs and freshly turned earth. I thought about the past months, about the betrayal, the illness, the legal struggle, and the quiet patience it had required to reclaim what was mine. I thought about my husband and our son, the love we had built brick by brick, and the pain of seeing that foundation questioned. But mostly, I thought about myself, about how I had endured, how I had chosen strategy over anger, persistence over despair. It was in this quiet reflection that I first noticed Arthur. He was standing across the street, leaning slightly on his cane, watching the sunset. I had seen him before, in passing, at the community center, but I had never spoken to him. There was something about the calm confidence in his stance, the gentle tilt of his head, that drew me in. I waved, and to my surprise, he waved back, a small, shy gesture that made me smile. The next morning, I returned to my routines, but with a new energy. I cooked breakfast, polished the counters, tended the flowers, and felt the life returning to every corner of the house. I began journaling again, writing letters I would never send, reflections on the days gone by, thoughts about what had been lost and what had been regained. Writing was cathartic. It allowed me to process emotions without needing an audience, without needing validation from anyone but myself. A few days later, I saw Arthur again, this time at the local pottery class. I had always loved pottery but never had the time. The clay felt cold and wet under my fingers, a familiar sensation I had missed. He was seated beside me, his hands moving deftly as he shaped the lump of clay before him. He glanced at me, offered a crooked smile, and said softly, "Most people quit before the second lump. The first lump is always ugly. The second one teaches patience." I laughed, the sound light and unburdened. "You'll try not to quit. Then," I said, And so began a quiet friendship, built on shared space, simple conversations, and mutual respect. Arthur had lived a long life, full of experiences etched into the lines on his face and the scars on his hands. He spoke little of himself at first, but when he did, it was with honesty, a kind of honesty I had rarely encountered. I found myself sharing more than I expected about the house. The betrayal, the reclaiming, the quiet victories. He listened, never interrupting, never judging, simply present. Our friendship grew in small moments. Shared lunches, walks in the park, discussions over the shapes and textures of pottery. He brought a sense of rhythm and calm that I had not known I needed. In his presence, I felt seen not as a woman who had been wronged, not as a grandmother, not as a mother, but simply as myself. There was no pity, no pretense, only acceptance. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a deep, ripe peach, he reached for my hand. There was no grand gesture, no declaration, just a warmth that settled over me like a soft blanket. And something within me, something that had been buried under years of fear, betrayal, and grief, began to bloom again. It was a small, quiet hope of kind that grows in the spaces between action and stillness, between caution and courage. The house continued to reclaim itself. 2. I repaired the birdhouse my husband had nailed to the maple tree, planted new flowers, and restored the garden to its former beauty. The rhythm of life returned slowly, deliberately, each day a testament to patience and resilience. I spent time in the kitchen, cooking meals for myself, sometimes sharing them with neighbors, but mostly enjoying the process. The house no longer felt like a battleground. It was a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe, think, and simply be. Arthur became a constant presence, but never intrusive. We shared stories, tips on gardening, and quiet afternoons filled with light and conversation. He admired the way I had handled the situation with my son and daughter-in-law. Not with anger but with strategy and patience. They underestimated you, he said once. Well, we shaped clay side by side, and you still chose quiet over cruelty. That takes a strength most people don't understand. In his company, I rediscovered parts of myself I had thought were lost. I laughed more freely, moved with less caution, and allowed myself to hope. Not for revenge, not for validation, but for the simple, profound joy of being alive, of being seen, of being present. The days continued, each one layering upon the last, building a life that was rich not just in memory but in experience. The house became a reflection of my resilience, my care, my dedication. Every nail, every board, every flower in the garden bore witness to the quiet power of endurance. And as the days lengthened and spring fully arrived, I realized that this period of reclaiming, reflection, and subtle growth was not the end. It was the beginning of something gentler, yet infinitely stronger. I did not need them to acknowledge my strength. I did not need the world to see. What mattered was the knowledge that I had endured, that I had reclaimed not only my home but my sense of self. I had faced betrayal, illness, and doubt, and emerged intact. And in that emergence, in that quiet reclamation, I found something I had not expected. The possibility of joy, of connection, of love rediscovered in the presence of someone who truly saw me. The mornings in my house had begun to feel sacred. Light poured through the windows, catching the dust in golden streams, illuminating the spaces I had fought so hard to reclaim. I moved with a sense of rhythm and calm that had been absent for years, each step a testament to endurance and patience. I had learned, finally, that the past did not define the choices I made now. The small daily acts of care and courage shaped the life I wanted to live. One afternoon, a letter arrived from my son. I had expected it eventually. The first few lines were awkward, almost hesitant, as though he were testing the waters, trying to measure whether reconciliation was possible. He apologized not fully, not entirely convincingly, but the effort alone was something. I read it twice, then set it aside. I knew forgiveness was a process, not a moment. My response would be measured, honest, and free from anger. That evening, Arthur came by as usual, carrying a small bouquet of early spring flowers. He He had taken to visiting nearly every day, sometimes to work on pottery, sometimes just to sit and talk. His presence had become a quiet anchor in my life, a reminder that connection could exist without judgment or expectation. "I think your garden might be the happiest place in town," he said, handing me the flowers. His eyes crinkled at the corners, reflecting a warmth that matched the sun sinking behind the maple tree. I smiled, accepting the blooms. "It's certainly growing happier by the day," I replied, much like its gardener. We sat together on the porch, watching as the last rays of light slipped below the horizon. The wind carried the scent of lilacs and damp earth, a reminder that life, despite everything, continued to bloom. For the first time, I felt that the weight of betrayal and grief had lifted, not completely. For those scars never fully disappear, but enough that I could move forward without fear or resentment controlling my steps. Weeks turned into months. The garden flourished, the house thrived, and I found myself reconnecting with friends I had long neglected. Simple joys a neighbor's visit, the laughter of grandchildren playing outside, the comfort of a quiet cup of tea became the measure of my days. Arthur and I grew closer, our bond built on respect, understanding, and shared experience. It was not a whirlwind of romance, but a steady, patient unfolding of trust and affection. One bright morning, I took a deep breath and walked through the house, noting how far I had come. Every corner held a story. The repaired windows, the polished counters, the blooming garden, all symbols of a life reclaimed. I realized that I no longer needed validation from anyone. I had fought for myself, endured hardships, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. I called my son the next day. Our conversation was careful, deliberate, yet filled with a sincerity that had been absent before. We spoke of boundaries, of respect, of the past, and of the future. There were no long apologies, no promises of perfection, just honest communication. It was enough. Sometimes, reconciliation does not mean forgetting, but rather acknowledging, understanding, and choosing to move forward differently. As I hung up, I felt a lightness in my chest. I was no longer a prisoner of my circumstances, no longer weighed down by betrayal or fear. I had found a way to stand firmly in my own truth, to nurture my spirit, and to embrace the beauty that still existed in the world. That evening, Arthur arrived with a surprise. He had arranged a small dinner on the porch, with fairy lights strung across the rafters and a simple bouquet of roses in the center of the table. "For new beginnings," he said softly, his eyes holding the kind of warmth that words could never fully capture. We ate, we laughed, and we talked late into the night. The stars sparkled above, indifferent to human struggles, yet somehow participating in our quiet celebration of resilience and life. I felt a deep, abiding peace, or recognition that I had survived, that I had endured, and that I had the capacity to love and be loved again. In the weeks that followed, I continued to rebuild my life with intention. I volunteered at the local library, hosted small gatherings for friends, and even started teaching a pottery class for seniors in the community. Each act, small and deliberate, reinforced my sense of purpose and autonomy. My home became not just a sanctuary, but a hub of life, laughter, and connection. Arthur remained a steady presence, a reminder that love could be gentle, patient, and unwavering. Our friendship blossomed into a quiet, enduring partnership that honored our histories and our scars, yet celebrated the possibilities of tomorrow. And in the stillness of the early morning, when the first light kissed the maple tree and the garden shimmered with dew, I realized that I had truly come home, not just to the house, but to myself. I was whole, resilient, and free. I had endured betrayal, faced fear, reclaimed my life, and discovered that joy could bloom even in the aftermath of pain. Life had given me a second chance, and I embraced it with open arms, open heart, and unwavering hope. The past was no longer a cage. It was a foundation, a testament to survival, strength, and the quiet power of persistence. And as I stood on the porch, hand in hand with Arthur, watching the sunrise paint the world in hues of possibility, I knew that the best chapters of my life were yet to come.